Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. An inflationary crisis, rising interest rates, and a global slowdown on the horizon. The federal government's challenge in its latest economic outlook: help Canadians and be ready for an economy that might get worse. The response now: targeted support and new spending worth $30 billion over 6 years.
In the months to come, we will be able to invest in the Canadian economy and to be there for the Canadians who need it the most, because we were responsible in April and because we are keeping our powder dry today.
But that new spending is drawing criticism from the official opposition, who say that is what got Canada into this position in the first place.
Don't tell me that every dollar of inflationary spending was necessary. They were irresponsible and they were unnecessarily profligate with the dollars of Canadians, and now people are paying the price.
That's right.
So does this plan do enough to address the issues of affordability in this country? And what about a response to a possible recession? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Elamin, Abdelmahmoud, Althia, and Andrew Coyne. Andrew, let's start with you. What did you make of the $30 billion in new spending over the next 6 years in terms of who it's trying to help, what it's trying to help?
Well, I got to say, it's actually a little more than that. If you look at comparing the budget numbers to the update numbers, so we're 6 months later, they got about $30 billion a year in new revenues because inflation was higher than expected. And they've spent about half of it, about $15 billion a year, over 5 years, closer to 75 or $80 billion a year. The trick they do is they issue these 5-year forecasts, and the curve is very flat. It looks like spending is growing very slowly. And what people don't notice is they keep revising the numbers every 6 months, so the whole curve shifts up. So in fact, they're spending massive amounts more than they were 6 months or a year or 18 months or 2 years ago, more than they projected they'd be spending now. Was all this spent terribly well considered? I think the jury would be very much out on that. There's the short-term imperative of covering off people who are hurt by high inflation, and they've done what they can on that. I don't think they want to overdo that for fear of making the disease worse than the cure. But the longer-term question that they are at least seized with is very anemic growth rates in this country, long-term growth rates that are very slow. Yeah. And I'm glad to see that they're at least talking about growth now rather than just redistribution, but they still don't show a lot of evidence of grasping what needs to be done to generate long-term higher growth rates. It's still very, very much the same old, let's put more money into an innovation agency or a growth fund, which will do very little to move the needle on this.
Althia, how much of who they've targeted or what they've targeted here is in response to what the Conservatives were pushing them to do, or is any of it?
Well, the Conservatives have for weeks been calling on the government to cut taxes on home heating, cut taxes on gasoline at the pumps. That's not in this fiscal update. And you wouldn't obviously expect it to be because, cutting the gas tax, the carbon price, for example, goes against their climate plan. Yeah. But I do think that this fiscal update is interesting politically because I think the cooperation agreement has actually helped the Liberals kind of cover off their left flank. And, Andrew might disagree with me, but this is actually a pretty, I don't know, prudent is the right word, but responsible. Like, it is seemingly moving in a different direction than other previous budgets and fiscal updates. And yeah. Chrystia Freeland had suggested that she was going there. Now, she is spending a fair bit as well. So it's, in ways, it's a bit of a Goldilocks. But you could see this as a signal that Minister Freeland is giving, that she is aware of the criticisms that they have been a big spending government, that they have made the problem worse, and that they are trying to court part of caucus, which doesn't see itself reflected in the policies of the government thus far. And also some of those red Tories who may look at Pierre Poilievre and think this guy's way too far, and trying to kind of get back a little bit of that mantle that Paul Martin got under Jean Chrétien of Liberals being good fiscal managers.
Probably easy to look responsible when you've spent hundreds of billions of dollars, though, right? I mean, it's sort of it'll all look easier after all the COVID spending. Chantal.
Yes, well, I suspect that somewhere in the back room in Ottawa, Althia has just given people reasons in the finance department and in Chrystia Freeland's office to have a drink. Prudent and responsible, those are the two words that they would like to hear tonight. Because I'm going to just talk about the politics of this fiscal statement. For one, fiscal statements, fiscal updates have rarely been used to announce structural change. They're about telling you where the government may go in the next budget, leaving a lot of options open. But Chrystia Freeland needed to do two things. One, to satisfy the NDP, which apparently she has. And two, to position the party in a better place versus Pierre Poilievre. And what she did today, setting for the first time a date for balanced budgets. I'm not saying that's going to happen. But they have set themselves up to campaign in the next election, saying they would balance the books by 27, 28, which is beyond the next election. And that's a shift from 2015, where the promise was elect us and we will run deficits. And there's a pivot there that is political, not driven by economics, but that goes to the reality that in the polls, at this point, a majority of Canadians think that the Conservatives are a better place to manage the economy than the Liberals.
So I wonder, though, a really important observation, but I wonder how credible the pivot is, Elamin, given the way the government has managed the economy to now, whether they've had to do it or not because of COVID.
Right. So that's the shadow that they're operating from. But I think prudent is one word. The other word to say, the other description of this is trying to have it both ways, right? So the idea of having this additional revenue, if they use the additional revenue to attack the deficit would have gone down from 56 billion to 23 billion. They would have halved it. They're not doing that. They're sort of saying, you know what, we're going to have a $36 billion deficit. And we know that spending programs by nature are inflationary. I think it's important to point out that, in a 92-page document, we do the thing where we Control F the whole document for words that we care about. Inflation appears 100 times. So they want to be, they want to appear seized with the idea of inflation. And one way of doing that is absolutely rolling out the programs for workers that they have, the measures for students. But also, just spending by its nature is inflationary. They're still going to get tagged with at least some of that. I also want to talk about the idea of future growth that Andrew mentioned, because we've been trying to skirt this conversation for some time. I think the notion of ducking what Canada's future growth is going to look like has been a hallmark of this government. But the idea of tabling something about the Canada Growth Fund, about $15 billion, and it's supposed to be our answer to the Inflation Reduction Act that the U.S. rolled out. Well, theirs is pegged at $700. Kind of comically underfunding ours.
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of a response to that, to be fair to the government. But Andrew, talk to what Elamin and Chantal talked about there, the credibility of the idea that now this is a responsible government that can balance the budget and even get to a surplus.
I think that's frankly fantasy. Let's remember, even the numbers that they posted as their baseline scenario, which, as I mentioned, they took all-time record levels of spending and have increased it even more. They're spending $40 billion a year more than they projected, even in budget 2021. That's 18 months ago. But leave aside that, that's the baseline scenario, which the budget more or less acknowledges is out of date. The downside scenario, the one where we actually go into recession, which is the most likely scenario, is showing deficits of $50 billion, not $30 billion. It's showing deficit going up next year, not down. The debt to GDP ratio going up, not down. So, and that's before the inevitable upward revisions in years to come. So I don't know where they managed to do this, where they keep hoodwinking people into thinking this is somehow prudent or frugal. It's not.
Chantal and then Althia.
I was listening to Andrew and I was reminded of all those Mulroney budgets that I covered where he was trying to address the deficit after Pierre Trudeau left office, and how little credit there is to be had for doing that. And I don't want to be cynical, but Andrew can be totally right. But what actually matters is the perception, and the perception is going to be, and I've seen it all over the place, prudent, responsible, those buzzwords are showing up in analysis.
30 seconds to you, Althia.
I thought you raised an interesting question about trust at the outset. A lot of people, I think, and this is what the Conservatives are suggesting in their daily question period, that, we're in this mess because the government brought us here. They brought us here because they didn't pull their spending early enough. The Bank of Canada brought us here because they didn't start raising interest rates early enough. And I think it's really important for the Finance Minister to be as clear and as transparent as she can be. And I know she's saying those words, but I don't know if she really is, to Andrew's point. So that people do not feel like their institutions are failing them, because I think that is a greater problem that all this has kind of brought to the surface.
20 seconds, Elamin, then I got to go.
I think there's something to be said about the fact that at this moment, Canadians are suffering, and like the notion of rolling out any measure of austerity is like not something that people can stomach. I think they want to see prudent financial management, and I think the idea is to project that image, whether it's like that 2024 problem. That's something that they want to worry about later. Right now, I think the idea is don't look like you're spending too much, but also don't look like you're out of touch with the fact that so many Canadians are suffering.
Welcome back to another round of At Issue. The Ford government has once again used the notwithstanding clause, this time in its negotiations with education workers in Ontario. Workers in Ontario are set to strike tomorrow after negotiations with the province broke down. The Ford government has passed back to work legislation to prevent a strike, but it has also invoked the notwithstanding clause to prevent a court challenge going forward. The Premier says the government has no other option.
They have left us with no other choice but to proceed with legislation. For the sake of Ontario's 2 million students and their parents, schools must remain open.
So, what does the use of this controversial clause mean for workers' rights in Ontario? And does the growing use of the notwithstanding clause need a federal response? Let's bring in that issue. Chantal, Elamin, Althia, and Andrew. I know all of you have so much to say about this, so I'll be very quiet and throw to you. I'm not sure I understand, Chantal, why the province couldn't just force the workers back to work with back-to-work legislation, which you could agree with or not, but why they had to invoke the notwithstanding clause to avoid a court challenge. I'm not sure I understand that. Maybe you do, but give me your take on what is happening here.
Yeah, well, back to work legislation is kind of an odd statement about something that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, for
one.
Yeah.
Two, I'm guessing the rationale they would use, which I don't agree with, is that the last time Ontario preemptively sent people back to work in the education sector, they got sued for millions of dollars for having failed the bargaining process and drawn outside the lines. So this has become, it's like buying an insurance policy, I think, or the notwithstanding clause has become the equivalent of a get out of jail card, the one in Monopoly, where you didn't care if you went to jail. Basically what it says is that the government of Ontario does not bother to figure out whether its legislation respects the charter, because it gets this card and says, I don't care, we're just going to ignore the charter because we can.
And what should people take away from that, Elamin, then? And do we need to examine the use of this notwithstanding clause and the way it is being used increasingly by provinces?
I sure would hope so. The Justice Minister this week said, there are a number of things one might do, and it really raises the question, well, which one might you do? I think there's sort of this increasing call for the federal government to use many of its powers that they have in this, namely disallowance as one that they could use to intervene in this particular case. They are understandably hesitant because the whole idea of intervening in a power that the provinces have should be something that they should tread lightly. But also, the provinces are not using this power in the ways that it was meant to be used. So perhaps it should not be used. So perhaps the federal government should use disallowance in a way that it's not also meant to be used. I mean, like these are extraordinary times.
That's sort of what you wrote about, Andrew, this week. That it should be the federal government does need to step in.
Yeah, I mean, if it was just a matter of this one isolated incident, that'd be one thing. But this is the third time that Doug Ford has attempted or actually implemented the notwithstanding clause. Once he was forced to back off. Yeah. We've seen twice in the last couple of years from the government of Quebec, once an attempt by the government of New Brunswick. So we're getting into, multiple uses of the notwithstanding clause. This thing that, to all accounts, was intended to be used extremely sparingly. And look, some people have no problem with the notwithstanding clause. I wish it didn't exist. But the saw-off that was made at the time of the 1982 Constitution was, we'll put it in as a safety valve, as an emergency escape hatch for extraordinary situations with runaway courts and rogue decisions, et cetera. It was never intended to be used for every little hangnail that a province had, and it certainly wasn't intended to be used prophylactically, if I can put it that way, as a catch-all preemptive strike in advance of any kind of judicial ruling. So we can't even look at the court's ruling and say, does it stand up? Does it make sense? Was this an unconstitutional provision or not? We just prevent the courts from ever even looking at it. Yeah, at some point, you have to say, do we just stand by and watch while the Charter of Rights, our central core statement of our values as a country, gets eviscerated by these tin pot autocrats? Or does somebody at some point say, we got to stand up for the foundational principles of the country?
Althia.
Well, I think Andrew makes a very good point. And in his column, which I thought, actually, I think, Andrew, you might have convinced me about using disallowance. When you talked about Bill 21 in Quebec and Bill 96, which attacks language rights in Quebec, we had talked really about, how disallowance hasn't been used since 1943. It's basically kind of doesn't exist anymore. And that really the option in front of the government was to ask the Supreme Court to weigh in on whether or not provincial governments or all governments could be using the notwithstanding clause preemptively. But Andrew makes a very good point in his column about how, if the provinces are using this to basically thwart a court case, why not use disallowance to thwart, at least, I don't know if you went that far, Andrew, I don't remember, but I think preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause, I think there's a good case to make for the federal government to use disallowance. I'm actually pleased that there is an outrage over Doug Ford's use of the notwithstanding clause this time, because the second time he tried to use it, successfully used it, there really wasn't that much of an outrage. And even in Quebec, where the notwithstanding clause, the use of it preemptively was fine for many Quebecers with Bill 21 and Bill 96. The fact that it's being used to attack collective rights is touching a nerve in that province. And there's lots of editorials on how this is outrageous that Doug Ford would use this. So it is, I think it's a good thing that we're having this discussion, and perhaps we can kind of put the genie back in the bottle and make this taboo again.
Chantal?
I tend to think that to respond to the nuclear option of the notwithstanding clause with the nuclear option of disallowance is the same thing as in every other escalation like that, mutually assured destruction. I believe that Doug Ford has opened an interesting door for Justin Trudeau to be more proactive on the issue. Doug Ford has basically sent a wake-up call to the entire labor movement across the country, including in Quebec, where the notwithstanding clause is not a no-no, but labor rights are sacred for many of the same observers. So if Justin Trudeau needed a peg to refer the entire issue of the preemptive use of the clause to the Supreme Court, he now has it. By the same token, he might refer the issue of whether the disallowance is a power that has gone out of practice because it hasn't been used for so long, or whether it is still a power that the federal government can use. But I believe at this point we need a referee more than a pissing match between nuclear powers, federal and provincial.
Quick response from you, Andrew, and then I got to go.
Well, nuclear options don't necessarily have to lead to mutual assured destruction. They can lead to deterrence.
You don't know that.
I'm not saying you don't know. You don't know it either. I'm not saying they should do it tomorrow. I'm not saying they should necessarily do it ever, but it can certainly be part of the toolkit. I agree that we would prefer to get to a negotiated solution on this. But if the alternative is that we just stand and watch while the charter is dismantled, that's not an acceptable alternative. So if somebody's got a better option, fine, I'm all ears. But let's not just pretend that the soft option is acceptable. It's not.
Okay. We'll talk about this again. It always seems to come back, the notwithstanding clause, and you always all have much to say. Thank you. Appreciate it.